of the Pan World Music Festival Sansar Sangeet Utsav. On behalf of IMPL, Carnatica Global, and Global Arts Temple USA, we are utmost delighted to have with us two very, very fantastic musicians who just performed now in something which was sounding magical. Uh, it's a very, very beautiful synthesis of which I've never heard before. Of course, I've heard these artists, but never heard this synthesis as a musician. And I was very intrigued and waiting forward to listening to them. Let me, without much ado, welcome one of the finest saxophone artists the world has seen, George Brooks. As an award-winning saxophone artist, Grammy nominee, he has performed all over the world with performing with jazz musicians and with the Indian classical musicians. So it's wonderful that he has bridged these two worlds very smoothly in his journey. It takes a lot to doing that because you have to be sensitive to different systems. And while doing that, I would like him to share his experience because he has traveled a lot. He's been performing for several decades now, and is one of the very, very early musicians to start this collaboration with musicians, Indian musicians in particular, the classical musicians. And I'd like him to actually talk about that. He's performed with maestros like Zakir Hussain, Pandit Hariprasad Chaurasia from the north, and from the south, Yushinivas, Vikku Vinayakaram, and again Rono Masundar from the Hindustani. And of course, he has performed with Western stars as well. So that goes as part of his work. He's also a brilliant, brilliant composer par excellence. Some of his compositions we really heard, which were unique. And I was wondering how would it be when he teams up with a magnificent sitar player, our ink artist, Arjun Verma. I would also like to welcome Arjun Verma to the show. He's a classical sitar artist who's again been performing with classical musicians, and he's been performing the traditional Hindustani music. And he's also been working on contemporary music, performing far and wide in Europe, Northern America, and India. He has had the privilege of learning from maestros like Ali Akbar Khan, the very, very finest musician that we can imagine from India, and his son, Alam Khan, to name a few. And now, currently, he has also received from Annapurna Devi and so on. His father himself was a great musician who had the privilege of learning from Pandit Ravi Shankar and Ali Akbar Khan. So having this background, it's not a surprise that we heard him being such a fine sitar player. I would now leave the stage to my friend and the maestro on the saxophone, George Brooks. Welcome to the show. And I'd like you to talk about how you actually changed the barriers when you took to collaborating with Indian musicians, particularly the very traditional Indian musicians. How did you break the barrier and get to collaborate with them?
Good luck, good fortune. I think, well, a lot of it comes from, my personal desire. I mean, we're talking back 1976 when I first actually heard Indian classical music. It was the same time I was just entered the New England Conservatory of Music to study jazz, to study Western music. But I took a course really just on a whim with a sitarist named Peter Rowe, who was called a Survey of Indian Classical Music. It was primarily Hindustani music at the time, Drupad, Khayal, instrumental music. And right away, I wanted to try to figure out some way of expressing what I was hearing on the saxophone. And fortunately, after graduating, I came to California. I met Pandit Pranath, the great Khayal vocalist. My wife at the time got a fellowship to go to India. I went with her and I spent 10 months living in Delhi, learning Hindi, learning how to take care of my Guruji in the traditional fashion, learning the vocal music, learning the essence of raga. So I think coming in from that very traditional, very sort of ancient approach to understanding the notes, understanding the sargam, understanding what the tambura means, coming in it from that place enabled me, when I came back to the US, to begin collaborating with sitarist Krishna Bhatt, and then through him meeting Zakir Hussain, and through Zakir Hussain being really presented to the world of Indian classical music, through him starting to work with Pandit Hari Prasad Chaurasia and Ustad Sultan Khan Saab, Ashish Khan. So, already part of the Ali Akbar Khan family and the Northern California Gharana, which is a real thing, since the 60s. And I was able to have these relationships with wonderful musicians who gave me so much and gave me both information and opportunity. So it's been a love, it's been a journey of love and desire on my part. I'm constantly inspired by what I hear from the young Indian musicians, as well as the old masters, as well as the masters of my tradition, both the contemporary and the older ones. So, I'm just thankful for the relationships I've had with the musicians who've been so generous with the music.
Yeah, what was very striking is the fact that whenever you compose, you very organically blended the systems without hindering the originality of any of the systems. The music that we just heard still had a very beautiful blend of harmony, melody, and it's very seamlessly blended.
Well,
And I was wondering, the only one thing common about sitar and saxophone was yes, that both starts from the letter S.
the letter S.
Yeah, but and Sansar Sangeet Utsav also starts from S. So I was thinking, wow, sitar meets saxophone and Sansar Sangeet. Yes, that's great. But then I was wondering, having all this, the robust sound of saxophone, how it's going to blend with very different. Sitar to me is one of the very sensitive, very soft, a very feminine kind of an instrument in Indian uh, parlance. That amalgamation in tonality that you brought in here was something magical. I was wondering how that would take place, but it sounded great. Um, so I would like you to share a little bit about that aspect. And I know that you're one of the earliest to travel to India. You've been still doing it year after year, coming here and performing. You perform for us in Bharat Sangeet Utsav. I performed in almost all the major cities and major festivals in India. So your experiences of this journey and your close connection with Indian music and Indians here and the audience, to the Indian audience too.
Um, well, Kate, we spoke about a lot of things, but sound, I think one of the things that was important is in my very early days sitting with Krishna Bhatt, a wonderful sitarist from Rajasthan, who lived actually, I can almost point to his house. He lived just a block away. So sitting close to him, I had to learn to modulate the sound of my instrument so that it was very soft, really. You have to learn to have the full dynamic range of the instrument. And if I'm trying to listen to the nuance of the meend as he's pulling it, to the sound of his sympathetic strings, I'm going to want to play very soft. I don't, and especially in my early days, I knew so little that I was mainly listening. So, just adding little bits. And then, Arjun, I think, is kind of a special collaborator in the fact that, although raised in the tradition of Indian classical music, and very seriously so, he's raised in the West. So his exposure to to this sense of collaboration, to the different elements that I might want to bring in, he's going to be open and sensitive to that, and he's looking for ways to reach across the the boundaries that don't actually exist, or maybe only exist in our minds. Um, I like to think as a composer, what I do comes from me honestly. I'm not trying to create something from an external intellectual place or a mathematical place. I'm looking to write music that I really hear. Some of it comes from improvisation, comes some of it comes from, sometimes I'll sit at the piano and work with the rhythms. Harmony, as you mentioned, is important to me, but harmony that stays within uh, the under, the understanding of the Indian classical reality. And sometimes, we'll push against that a little bit. Um, in this case, Arjun and I created all the music together, doing layers, low sitar, middle range sitar, high sitar. I played some bass clarinet with the low strings of the sitar, which really was kind of a unique moment for, I think, both of us to really feel the power of that sound.
Yeah, I
Yes, I
Arjun,
think
could feel
if I
that.
can jump in,
Yeah.
that
Yes, I'm
for me,
gonna get back. I get to Arjun. Arjun,
sure, yeah.
first of all, your journey must have been very inspiring to be sitting alongside. First of all, your father would have inspired you a lot and told you his journey itself. You must have been very, very young when he would have learned from all those masters. And then, you yourself later on had the opportunity to learn from such eminent stalwarts. The main thing about this Indian Gharana tradition is the solidity, the base in which they preserve it. They have preserved it for centuries now in certain Gharanas, and to follow that, and then to start experimenting. Please share some of your experiences.
Yeah, well, it's definitely been an amazing journey, and for me, it's been a journey of constantly deepening into the art. I started when I was 5, as so many people who are lucky enough to have it in their family. They're introduced. I mean, that's when I picked up the instrument, of course. Before I was born, I was listening even. So I was lucky to have that exposure. And in the beginning, a kid doesn't have these notions of a career or even gharana or anything. It's just very immediate. And so the way I remember that, my father started me off, someone had shown up with a sitar, a child-sized sitar, just kind of out of the blue for him, one of his students, and at a fortuitous time. And so he said, "Would you like to play sitar?" And I said, "Yeah." Just like that, simple. Just and so then we started, and in the beginning it was very sweet, and he trained me very diligently and carefully. And then by the time I was 10, I was performing on the international stage at the United Nations in Geneva and other European venues as well as US. And so, at that point, I started to see, the wider social impact that this can have, that connecting with people internationally. But still, I was, a child. I still didn't quite have figured out how this is going to fit in my life. So then when I went to study with Ali Burkhan when I was 15, then it was like jumping in the deep end. It was like going into the deep part of the ocean for me. So then it opened up a completely new universe, even as much as my father had taught me over 10 years. So going into that, then I really began to fall in love with it deeply at that point. And then at a certain point, I sort of woke up and realized that I don't really want to do anything else in terms of my main work in my life. So from that point on, it's been my primary focus. And you said something about how the Gharana traditions so solidly preserve these traditions. I think what was so powerful learning from the maestros I did was not only the sense of preserving the traditional thing, but almost like I think of it more like a greenhouse or a garden full of rare varieties of very beautiful plants or vegetables or something. They're living things to me. And they very much were to Ali Burkhan as well. He kind of, if I can speak for him a little bit, I think he sort of detested the excessive categorization of and sort of putting things in boxes. You know, okay, there's 7 types of, you know, this family of ragas and that kind of raga, and here's their, you know, 10 attributes, and that's it. You know, he said, you know, one time I remember someone had come to give a lecture, and they were presenting things in that way, and he was very upset afterwards. He said he's trying to kill the ragas, you know, because they're alive to him. Each one is a unique being, you know, just as each human being we meet, we can say, you know, certain attributes about them, their culture, their ethnicity, their occupation, whatever, but ultimately that person is a unique thing in the universe, you know. And so I think he also viewed ragas like that, and I certainly took that on, that it's like we've inherited this rare garden from the masters past, and some masters, they add new plants to that garden, like Ali Khan added, you know, some of his gems of musical compositions, like rags like Chandranandan and Madhumalati, and these kind of things which have some of it, which many people have taken on today because they love it so much. So the garden grows over time, but it's not static, right? So there's some essence which is going back, you know, 500 years, and a deeper essence going back 1,000 years, and then even millennia before that. But in the modern age, it relies on all of us gardeners, musicians as gardeners, to water these plants and to see where they're growing, you know. And so for me, the progress of music, or its development in the modern age, is a very organic thing. And I also don't, you know, as much as I am very traditional about how I'm trying to play these ragas, these traditional ragas, I also see that they're so related to so many musics around the world, which is why it's been especially a pleasure to work with George, because he's one of these rare musicians who's learned all these different types of music, and I feel like these kind of musicians, we can see the fundamental essential points in common among music. You know, there's not something essentially different about jazz or Indian classical music or Chinese traditional music or African traditional music. There's different emphasis and specialties and performance practice and styles, but it's based on this phenomenon, which is sound conveying emotion through the air, that it's conveying emotion to us. That's a universal human experience. And so, you know, projects like this are give me an opportunity to further explore that sort of universal truth, if you will.
The main thing that was wonderfully explained, it's brilliant hearing that explanation. In fact, like what your guru said and whatever you've been sharing, not just the ragas in Indian music, even as early as documented evidences, right from Sangeet Ratnakar or even before that, it clearly talks about every note having an emotion, every note being a live being. So that's how it's been seen. So I can truly sense that as a musician, how we all feel about it. And when I come to the next section, that I wanted to ask you one more question from both of you. I know that Indian music has a different kind of an ornamentation, the, the gamaks that we call. And when George and you work together for the raga system to play, um, how, I mean, this is for our audience to know how you have really collaborated on that front. From George's side and from your side, both of you can explain a little bit about
Um, well, I don't think actually it's something that we actually discussed, the gummicks and the ornamentation. For me as a player, obviously there are things that the saxophone is really not particularly good at doing. Simple meaned is something that you kind of have to fake a little bit on the saxophone. You know, you're not going to go from Komal Ni down to Sa. I mean, there are things that you can do beautifully on the sitar that the saxophone isn't quite created for. So, yeah, that is not something we discuss, but it's something that I practice in my playing. If I sit with I mean, lately I've been doing some composing with Kala Ramnath, the violinist, a wonderful Hindustani artist. And the violin is, although a Western instrument, has all the capability of doing the type of ornamentation that that Indian music requires, which I think is why it's such a popular instrument among Indian classical music. So I will do things like I'll take a segment of her playing and I'll put it on a digital waveform and I'll slow it way down and I'll try to say what actually is that move. Or when I'll sit in person with uh, let's say Krishna Bhatt, or a sitarist, what is that ornamentation? And I will try to understand them and then make them work in a way that works for the saxophone, or figure out a way to sort of fake it so I give the feeling of that ornamentation even if the actual physical movements are not so available to me on my instrument.
Yeah, I think the ornamentation thing, yeah, we didn't discuss it, and it's, I mean, I think in a lot of forms of music, it's a very natural thing. Even you hear, R&B singers or some other genre. There's all kinds of vocal inflections that add beauty and power, that I think are often done somewhat intuitively. It's part of the stylistic idiom, and certainly saxophone has all kinds of beautiful ornaments that sitar also can't play, things that are jumping around or certain sort of timbral things. So I think we both just naturally added these in. I think what helped that to work so well was the mutual sensibility and sensitiveness to creating space, for these things. For instance, in the song I think we played third, Suha Kafi, or opening, which I composed the main layers on, and then George added on. In the beginning, it's very sort of sparse. It's sort of this bed of very simple layers, just sort of oscillating parts, and that created this kind of space for the saxophone to come in with its full timbre and have this very beautiful solo. But it augmented that with all this sort of other things going on. And then vice versa, when sitar is going through some sensitive things, the saxophone is kind of using a more gentle tone, and it's creating space for that. So I think that sensibility helped it to be much more successful. There's another thing, which is, there's it's not a lost art, but it's sort of maybe de-emphasized in somewhat in the modern musics. Is the old tradition of European classical music. I've actually been doing a bit of research about this. So in the Baroque era, European classical music, the time of Bach and earlier, they were experts in ornamentation, and there was like hundreds or maybe even thousands of different types of small ornamentations, very much like Indian classical. They had their own, types, but a lot of them are in common actually. And I've been looking into this, in fact, because I'm working on a commission right now for members of Philharmonia Baroque Orchestra here in the Bay Area, creating a piece of Indian classical and Baroque European classical that's exploring these kind of connections. And one of the things that stood out to me is the ways they figured out to integrate the ornaments on top of harmony, because harmony is such a big thing, and when you have so many layers, especially if many notes hit at the same time, it can sort of bury that ornament. And so they came up with interesting ways. One of them is putting the ornament before the beat, da 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 da, this kind of thing, where the kind of delicate things are coming before all the sound hits. Or another way is extending that ornament after the hit, so that once again it pops out underneath that hit of sound. So techniques like that, I think, we can draw from the Western tradition, because they are masters of harmony, and use that aesthetic with the particular Indian idiom of ornamentation.
That's indeed wonderful, wonderful. The reason that I asked you this was, a lot of people, whenever they think, the other thing that I was really finding very special about your presentation is a lot of times is contemporary efforts to blend and come together as artists. Sometimes it becomes a little bit of an effort to project one over the other, but the layering made it really beautiful. Actually, the blend that you brought in, where when one is more prominent, the other one supports it, and then seamlessly lets and then the takeover happens organically. And this very smooth transition of layers that you created into the pieces made the entire presentation sound unified. And I also enjoyed that uh, the blend of the wind versus the string was so beautiful in terms of bringing in different sound combinations to a listener, from a musical perspective. And the fact that you didn't have an additional percussion over this was something I enjoyed a lot. I'm sure all the listeners have enjoyed that, because it just brought uh, just the two of you together musically, giving a very, very smooth. It was almost like doing a musical massage to the ears. So that was a feeling, so very relaxed sounding, and at the same time, it's the sound itself was so soothing on the mind of the listener. So I would once again like to thank both of you for having been a part of this edition of Sansar Sangeet Utsav. And soon after the pandemic, hopefully, you know, we would like you all to visit India and perform as a team for our next edition, which should be live, God willing. And this team, um, I wish, can continue performing and enthralling audience all over the world. Two brilliant minds and great musicians and composers in your own rights coming together is something that every music listener will look forward to. Thank you
Thank you
for
so much.
joining.
Thank you, Shashi.
Thank you,
Real
Shashi.
pleasure.
Yeah, we really commend you on your endeavor. It's quite a wonderful thing that you're doing, and we were very honored and happy to be a part of it. So thank you for inviting us.
Indeed.
Thank you again, Arjun. Fantastic hearing you hearing you speak as much as hearing you play. So, of
Thank you
course,
so much.
George, I have interacted a little bit more with George, but knowing you and your mind, musical mind, is thinking very deep. That's no wonder that George has chosen to collaborate with you. So,
Thank you.
wish we can hear a lot more of both of you and share a lot more of your music. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.